Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Narwhal's very first Ontario event. I am Denise Balkissoon. I am the chief of this new Ontario Bureau, and my son is having dinner, so I'm sorry if anyone hears him. He's trying to be as quiet as he can. So we would love to hear where you are joining us from today. So at any time during the session, if you have anything to say in the chat box, please just drop it in there. And so right now, if you'd like to tell us where you're from, that's great. We also have a poll question that should pop up to ask people where they're from more generally. What part of Canada, or if you're joining us from outside of Canada, please let us know. I myself am in Toronto, and I would like to say that I'm grateful to work in Toronto, which is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas, and the Anishinaabeg, as well as Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. For those of you who are less familiar with the Narwhal, let me just tell you a little bit about us. The Narwhal is a digital publication about Canada's natural world. We are based in British Columbia, and we are a pioneer of nonprofit journalism in Canada. We're supported by over 3,700 members. And for any of our members that are here today, thank you so much for supporting us and for joining us. Last March, the Narwhal became Canada's first English language registered journalism organization, which means that all of our members and donors receive tax receipts. We launched the Ontario Bureau at the end of September, so we've only been around for 2 months, and runway funding for this Bureau was provided by 3 philanthropic foundations. And those are the McConnell Foundation, the Metcalf Foundation, and the Echo Foundation. And we've also won a lot of awards for our work, not the Ontario Bureau, but that's coming. But the Narwhal so far has won a lot of awards. And the one that I'd like to highlight today was given to Amber Bracken, a photojournalist who received last year's Charles Bury President's Award from the Canadian Association of Journalists for her coverage of the Wet'suwet'en crisis in 2020. So as you all know, the crisis on Wet'suwet'en territory is still happening, and Amber is still covering it. And as many of you probably know, last week, she and another journalist, Michael Toledono, were arrested by the RCMP along with 13 land defenders. So I'd like to take this chance to ask you all to support press freedom in Canada. The actions of the RCMP prevented us from publishing photos last week of police destroying the door of a tiny home with axe and chainsaws, and then pointing assault rifles at Wet'suwet'en people defending their unceded territory. While Amber sat in jail for days, she could have been reporting on an alleged assault on Indigenous rights and the role of government officials and a private gas pipeline company. Amber has finally been released from jail on the condition that she appears on contempt of court charges in February, but we have a long battle ahead of us in defending her and ultimately the right of all journalists to report from within injunction zones in Canada. So we need your help. Our insurance won't cover Amber's legal fees, and we're hoping that those of you who aren't already members and are in a position to do so will help them and continue to stand up for press freedom by becoming a member today. And I think the link for that is just been dropped in the chat. You can also always find it on our site, thenarwhal.ca. And as a bonus, anyone who signs up by midnight tomorrow gets a very cool Narwhal toque. All right, but it's actually quite warm, so I'm going to take this off in a minute. A little bit of housekeeping. This session is being recorded and will be available for viewing online after the event. So there will be an email tomorrow with a link to the video and the chat discussion. The chat transcription will only be available to people that are here right now. We are also providing closed captioning. So to turn that on, go to your control panel at the bottom of your screen and select the arrow next to closed captioning to turn it on. You can also select caption settings to control the size of the captions, and you can move the caption box anywhere around your screen. And if you have questions about any of that, you can put that into the Q&A box, or questions about the discussion as we go on. There will be, at the end of the formal panel discussion, we'll have a Q&A session. So please, if there's anything you need to know about the Greenbelt, ask it now. We have some really smart experts here who have all the answers for you. We know that you all care about the Greenbelt since you're here, but we'd also like to know what environment and climate change in Ontario are important to you. So another poll question should be coming up on your screen right now, where you can let us know what issues in Ontario you would like us to cover as we go forward with our brand new bureau. So I am going to introduce that bureau now. Coming onto your screens should be Fatima Syed and Emma McIntosh, our two Ontario reporters. Hi, Fatima, and hi, Emma.
Hello.
Well, hello.
So Fatima has written blockbuster reporting on the pandemic for the Toronto-based nonprofit news outlet, The Local, and she hosts the Canadaland politics podcast, The Backbench. She's also previously reported for the Toronto Star and the National Observer. Emma has worked previously as an investigative reporter at Star Metro Calgary, and most recently as Queen's Park reporter at National Observer. In 2019, her investigation with Mike D'Souza, who is the managing editor at the Narwhal now, into an oil sands leak that affected Fort McKay First Nation, won a Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Human Rights Reporting. All right, so I have some questions for you too before our panelists come on. So Fatima, what is your favorite thing so far about joining the Narwhal?
Oh man, there's so many, but I think the most recent highlight that is, was meeting the Ontario Environment Minister's dog. For those of you who don't know me, I am not a dog person. Dogs actually terrify me, but this dog was the calmest, glossiest dog I've ever met. And it was a really interesting experience interviewing the environment minister with his dog just like laying at my feet or just like walking around. That's never happened to me as a journalist before. But then of course the conversations that the Narwhal's having about Ontario has also been really exciting. We get to dig deep into so many things and I'm really looking forward to more.
And Emma, what about you? What has been the best thing about being a Narwhal so far?
I think the thing that has brought me the most joy so far is just like how much people, like all of you on this event today, care about what we do and are engaged on this stuff. I noticed that when Fatima and I are in the room at Queen's Park asking questions about climate and the environment, it gets everyone else interested too. And when we write about these things, other people tend to write about them too and start talking about them. And that just makes me really happy to know that people actually care. The other thing is, I'm really excited for what's up next. And I feel like we have some good goals. For me, my number one goal is digging deep into some investigations in the new year. I feel like we've spent all this time getting ready and getting the ball rolling and getting all these stories out to get into a good rhythm. Now we get to settle in and do the really juicy stuff. Fatima, what are you looking forward to goal-wise?
I'm excited to cover the election. The Ontario election should be spicy and eventful, to say the least one can hope. And after everything that's happened over the last few years, it will be interesting to see how voters respond to everything. And elections are unpredictable, so I'm excited to see what will happen. We literally started, our first day was the day after the federal election, so we're still brand new. Denise, as our chief, what are your goals for us?
I think my goal would be to really bring the flavor of the Narwhal to Ontario, which is like really smart and in-depth journalism about the environment and climate that really, gives our audience credit for caring about these things and being smart enough to learn and being smart enough to tell us what we need to know. Because I've always believed my entire career that the audience for journalism is sort of underestimated, and it's really amazing how much people care about the Narwhal and interact with our stories and spend time with them, and it's really awesome. So I'm really excited to bring that to Ontario, and the election, that's going to be good. So I'm going to hand this over to the two of you. Emma is going to introduce the guests and lead the discussion. Fatima will handle the Q&A after. So again, if you have questions about the Greenbelt as we go along, please drop them in the box. Before I go, I just wanted to ask again that everyone watching today who isn't already a member, maybe consider becoming one, because we'd really like to bring the Narwhal to Ontario and we need your support to do so. Okay, so thanks very much, and I'm leaving, and Emma, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Denise. And it gives me very much joy to introduce our three experts today who maybe, I'm not saying this definitively, but they might love the Greenbelt as much as me, possibly more. We'll see, we'll get into it tonight. Our first one is Hassan Bassett. He's the president and CEO of Conservation Halton. And if you aren't aware, Conservation Halton encompasses Milton, Halton Hills, Burlington, Oakville, and even parts of Mississauga, Hamilton, and Puslinch. So Conservation Halton delivers environmental planning and flood forecasting and operations, science and monitoring, environmental restoration, stewardship, forestry operations, and education. So he does a lot. Hassan also oversees a vibrant system of eco parks that is spread out over 10,000 acres. And I highly recommend going to these parks if you haven't already. Our next guest, Victor Doyle. Thank you for joining us, Victor. From 1988 to 2017, Victor worked in the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, where he was at the center of provincial planning in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. He's best known as the lead planner of Ontario's Greenbelt, the reason we are all here today. Hi, Victor. And he was also instrumental in developing and implementing the Oak Ridges Moraine Plan, which is a really important predecessor to the Greenbelt. And so specializing in watershed planning and the oversight of urban development and natural resource management, Victor's now engaged in advocacy initiatives in this region. Welcome. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Justina Ray is the president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada. Her research is about environmental assessment and biodiversity conservation. She's been on numerous government advisory panels related to policy development for species at risk and land use planning in Ontario and Canada. And if that wasn't impressive enough for you, she's also an adjunct professor in the University of Toronto's Department of Ecology and Evolution and the Institute of Forestry and Conservation, and in the Trent University Environmental and Life Sciences graduate program. So thanks all of you for being here. To kick things off, we're going to give each panelist a couple of minutes to tell us what they see as the most important and the most interesting aspects of the Greenbelt. So let's jump right into it. Victor, you were there in the beginning. Can you give us a short history of the Greenbelt?
Well, thanks, Emma. I had a couple of images I thought someone was going to throw up on the screen for us, just to give the audience a bit of context for the Greenbelt. I'm a geographer in part by training, so I love maps. And this map here, I think, just shows you North America, and the Greenbelt, Ontario's Greenbelt, is nestled in the heart of the Great Lakes region. And I think it's important to think of things at a continental scale as well as a local scale and a global scale as well. But just to work through this, so at this scale, we have 1/5 of the world's surface fresh water in the Great Lakes that the Greenbelt feeds and touches upon. We also have 50% of all the Class 1 soils in all of Canada, tucked away in southern Ontario and encompassed by some of them by the Greenbelt. So to the next slide, southern Ontario and the Golden Horseshoe, which we call it, is also home though to about 1/3 of Canada's population, 70% of Ontario's population. We're growing by about 100,000 plus people every year for the last 25 years. And it's the impacts of accommodating that growth through sprawl that really gave rise to the Greenbelt. And this slide shows that it's big. The Greenbelt covers about 2 million acres, and it is arguably the biggest and most strongly protected Greenbelt in the entire world. So think globally, act locally. So just a little bit more about the impacts of sprawl. And here you can see the Greenbelt at a much more close scale. And the brown area you see are the urbanized areas in Ontario, and the Greenbelt's outlined in green, of course. And the impacts have been immense. We've lost 40% of our farmland in Ontario. Everywhere we've urbanized in those brown areas, our forests, the quality of our forests and surface waters is poor to very poor. So they aren't quality. And you know, the greenhouse gas emissions from the urbanization are our biggest source. The biggest source is the car-dependent, low-density development that we see in the region. And all these impacts cost tens of billions of dollars a year. So lots of people have called me an environmentalist, and I say, well, I'm an economist as well. And so we need to keep that lens in mind when we're thinking about protecting nature in terms of its ecological goods and services, and supporting things like farming, which is the second or third biggest economic sector in all of Ontario, and same with the number of jobs in the broader agri-food sector. And so the dark green within the Greenbelt, you'll see is what's called our natural heritage system. And this is where the vast majority of wetlands, woodlands, and rivers are located. And so the Greenbelt protects these areas very strongly, and it also protects it from major urbanization because it does not allow the conversion of farmland for urban purposes. So those two main policy planks in the Greenbelt Plan are what really help protect it for perpetuity, hopefully, because we need to think hundreds, if not of years, if not longer, into the future. And if we look at the next slide, going a bit back to a bigger scale, the Greenbelt connects to other areas in the province and even to the United States. So to the right, we have the Adirondacks to Algonquin corridor, the bottom left in green, the Carolinian zone along the north shore of Lake Erie, and then up to the northwest, the whole Great Lakes Heritage Coast. And so for climate change and the migration of flora and fauna, these broader connections are really important. So the Greenbelt Plan, if we go to the next slide, was subject of a big review in 2015 to 2017, and it concluded that the plan was working really well. And the government strengthened it even on that basis. And it was working so well, a lot of community and environmental groups thought we should expand it. And they came up with this map, which is euphemistically called the Blue Belt. The government of the day started consulting on it. Current government shelved that and is undergoing their own much smaller potential expansion consultation as we speak, mainly focused in the Waterloo area on the Periscope moraines and some of the river valleys in the built-up areas. So just to close my remarks, we'll go to the last slide and see the top pictures are a picture of people planting trees in the 1940s because the Oak Ridges moraine was denuded by clearing for agriculture, and the streams dried up, the soils blew away, and Ontario's first reforestation efforts began in 1941, the results of which you can see an example of below with the beautiful Ganaraska forest. And this gave rise in 1946 to the Conservation Authorities Act and the creation of conservation authorities. And so my parting message is, if we give nature a chance, it's very resilient. And that's why efforts like the Greenbelt are really important over the decades and centuries to come.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you, Victor. That really sets the stage for where we're going next. I'll move on to Hassan, who is helping to manage a huge and wonderful swath of the Greenbelt right now. Hassan, I learned a lot from Fatima's story about conservation authorities that came out this week. And thank you so much for talking with us, giving your perspective. I wanted to ask you, for your opening statement, what are the most pressing issues for Conservation Halton today? And what's your favorite thing to do in the Greenbelt? I know it must be hard to choose.
Okay, well, thanks, Emma, and thanks for having me on this panel today. You know, I was excited to actually listen to what Justina and Victor had to say. So be just as happy being in the audience, members. But you've asked a question that has a broad answer, and it's difficult to pick. But maybe I'll pick up where Victor stopped off. And talking a little bit about conservation authorities, formed in 1946. We're still here, and if you aren't sure, there's a lot of noise over the last year about CAs. I would encourage you to actually read Fatima's piece, because it tells you exactly where we are in that journey with changes to the Conservation Authorities Act. But let's park that for a minute, and let's look at the Greenbelt as well. And so when you look at both of these things, the CAs and the Greenbelt, both creations, if you will, were ahead of their time. They were looking at root causes, to problems, but also looking at opportunities. They were looking at what would give Ontario a competitive advantage in the future. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that if a province, a region is paying attention to conservation and environmental concerns, that it wouldn't give them a competitive advantage in the future, because it will, because we're not just talking about, the environment for the sake of environment. We're talking today with climate change, risk, financial risk, livability, of our communities, the health of people who live in these communities. So investing in these areas has a financial benefit attached to them. When you look at conservation authorities, Victor had a really great example of deforestation. So you had deforestation across Ontario, you had lots of erosion, poor soil quality, and then you had flooding issues. And most of the time, these things go hand in hand. The province's response to that in the 40s was to actually come up with a watershed-based solution that looked at multiple barriers or multiple levels of solutions. So let's not just engineer our way out of a flooding problem. Let's not just build dams. Let's look at the whole watershed. Let's look at where we can do reforestation, where we can do stream rehabilitation, where we can come up with regulations on where people should build or not. So this was a visionary undertaking. When you look at the Greenbelt today, it was the same thing. It was the next big idea, ahead of its time, a wonderful creation. Now, you park both of those things, and are we building on those successes, or are we actually squandering the head start that we got because of those two visionary things? And so I know my time's almost up with the 3 minutes, but the Greenbelt, to come back to that, it cannot just be lines on a map. It cannot just be something that continues to feel like it's precarious, that it's still being questioned, that it can be eroded or chipped away or edged away. We have to invest in it. We have to restore it. We have to study it. And we have to make decisions on whether to grow it and where to grow it based on science and data.
Thanks for that, Hassan. I'm going to grant you some extra bonus time because I really do want to know what your personal favorite Greenbelt activity is. I don't know if you can pick, but maybe we can narrow it down to hikes.
I can certainly pick. Being a conservationist I do it for a living, but I think it becomes a way of life as well, right? I am all about people and places. So when you protect the environment, you have to find a way to get the people involved in it. So my favorite activity within the Greenbelt is actually, as you said, hiking. And I have learned to go out all 4 seasons and with my family, and it's just fantastic, so that whole aspect of accessibility is really, really important. Nature cannot be up there. Nature cannot just be in wealthier parts of our communities. Nature has to be everywhere. It has to be accessible. And at Conservation Halton, we have a huge focus on that. And I've always said, just as communities grow, there's a lot of planning that goes into it, right? So as a municipality is looking at growth targets, 2031, 2041, 2051, they're looking at ensuring that they have enough roads, they have enough pipes, they have enough fire services, hospital beds, teachers, all of those things. Are we also looking at what is going to be our standard for accessibility to green space? What is it today? And are we going to look to improve on that, or are we going to look to ignore it? So I think that's something that I'd really like embedded within our communities, because I think it's very, very important to have these spaces to be able to visit, because if you grow to love something, then you can fight to protect it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you so much for that. And I will throw in, hiking is a close second for me, but I brought it up before. My favorite Greenbelt activity is definitely rock climbing, specifically at Rattlesnake Point, which is an amazing park. So now we'll go to Justina. What do you see as the most important thing for our audience to know about the Greenbelt? And what do you see as the biggest challenge in its immediate and its long-term future?
Thanks so much, first of all, for having me, and I'm honored to be on this panel with Victor and Hassaan as well, and the inaugural Narwhal event. So how exciting is that? So I come from strictly a nature and biodiversity perspective, and I think that a lot of us have had the experience where we've been traveling a stretch of road or something like that we've done it again and again over a course of years, and we've seen the change, the removal of nature, the homogenization of new buildings and development and so forth. So we can experience that, but rarely do we understand the larger picture in terms of how dramatic some of the numbers have been, because actually a lot of the change is extremely gradual and imperceptible to most people, that particularly those that live in urban environments. And so we've heard a little bit about deforestation already, but 90% of Southern Ontario was at one point covered with forests, and we've lost about 75% of that. We've lost 75% of the wetlands in Southern Ontario. We only have about 2% of all of the original grasslands that used to be there. But we also have this tremendous wealth. I mean, it would astound most people to know that of known species in Ontario, there are 30,000 or so. And we have like over 4,000 beetle species in Ontario. We've got about 400 bee species. So the wealth, and much of it is concentrated in Southern Ontario. But a lot of it is just, leaving us in a very imperceptible way. We don't monitor well enough. We don't understand the diversity well enough. All of these things are being dramatically but imperceptibly losing. And now we have these patches of natural habitat left in a lot of places, and really all of it is valuable at this point. Like every single wetland that we have is valuable. All the forests that we have are valuable. And why does this matter? Well, we understand more and more about the incredible links between the state of nature and human health and well-being. That is becoming more and more clear. There was a landmark report a couple of years ago that really started understanding and documenting in a very important way from a global perspective how critical this is. We've noticed also in the pandemic how important our connections to nature are. It's important for our psychological health. The pandemic itself was sparked a lot because of the dysfunction of our biodiversity relationship with environment. So the Greenbelt, well, it came at this incredible time where it was saving the best of what's left. It recognized values. It contains a third of all the species at risk in Ontario, and it also noticed, and it was also for the point of view that business as usual approaches to making development decisions are really insufficient. Where we left to our own devices, we do a terrible job. We just chip away one decision at a time. We have way too much arrogance about how we're going to be able to mitigate impacts, mostly because we can't see the cause and effect in front of us. Most of the time, we don't understand. It doesn't unfold in a way that is that we're aware of. And so the Greenbelt does represent an extraordinary and proactive means of saving what we have proactively and putting limits to our activity. Thanks.
Thanks, Justina. That's so important. You're right. Well, now that you three have set the stage, this might not surprise anyone who knows me, but I still have questions. I have many, and I know that most of you do as well. The place where I wanted to start for the broader discussion was about smart growth. We know that Southern Ontario is growing and that it has to, because so many people are moving to this region every year, as we've already talked about. And we also know that if we're not careful, development can harm the Greenbelt. And often this is presented to us like an either or choice. Is it actually an either or choice, or can we have both? And I want this one to go to Victor first, because I would love to also talk about municipalities who feel constrained by this kind of discussion. You know, like Scugog has said that they feel limited by Greenbelt restrictions. How do we tackle that? So what do you think, Victor?
In my mind, there's no question at all that it's not an either or proposition. We can protect the green belt and the broader landscape within the Golden Horseshoe and accommodate the millions of people that are moving here and that have moved here in the last couple of decades. And the way we do that, in my opinion, and based on my experience, is by looking inwardly to redevelop and revitalize all the existing communities, particularly the post-World War II suburbs, and to use all the land, and we have lots of land already approved for more urbanization. And collectively doing those, directing growth inward to those areas, it'll create all sorts of jobs and new businesses and the ability to revitalize these neighborhoods. It will save our farmland. It will save the natural features and the water quality out in the unurbanized portions of the landscape. It will reduce our greenhouse gas emissions because car-dependent growth and low-density buildings are our two biggest sources. It will save us all sorts of money, and it will allow for a mixture of housing types that people can afford, as we've seen, you know, prices for historic single detached house go through the roof beyond the reach of so many households. So it's a win-win. And so I don't think it's an either or whatsoever. And just last week, we saw the city of Hamilton, their municipal council voted 11-3 to pursue a firm urban boundary to accommodate their growth to 2051, which is the planning horizon we're working with. And there was a huge groundswell of support from Hamiltonians that encouraged their council to do just that. And so I think people are increasingly seeing that it's not an either or, and that we can have the best of both worlds and actually a better world by planning and pursuing smart growth in a much more robust and intensive way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
And if I guess I should talk about Scugog. So, you know, all municipalities are not created equal. Yeah, you look around the landscape and some are really positioned well to accommodate urban growth. They have subways and rapid transit and universities and hospitals, et cetera. And others are blessed with the remaining farmland and the key natural areas. And it's important, in my mind, to see that different municipalities play different roles. And I think we'll get into it a bit more about how that might be accomplished, but not every municipality in Ontario is suited or should be able to accommodate major urban growth.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Justina, where do you fall in this? What are you thinking about when it comes to balancing the smart growth with environmental protection?
Balance is a rough word because it's not, as a scientist, I have a real trouble with it because it's usually more of a political construct in the sense that, you know, where decision makers will use it and as a means to sort of gauge what are the negatives and the costs and benefits of various stakeholders and political decision makers and so forth. So from my point of view, I do think that we have to pay attention to the limits, and the limits both of our understanding, limits to the ability to be able to accommodate growth and to be able to mitigate the impacts. And that will be absolutely necessary and is becoming increasingly necessary. And that's why why the Greenbelt is so significant and particularly when it was developed, because it did prescribe limits. And there are plenty of places that do not have limits, but this one is one that really celebrates some particular values that have to be preserved, or else they'll we will not develop properly around them. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up values, because I think we'll get into that with our next question. But first, Hassan, I wanted to bring you in on this, especially with your unique role being like on a conservation authority. How do you feel about it? Where is that balance, I guess, if we can use that word again?
So being at a conservation authority, we wear a lot of hats, right? We are a regulator, which means that's when we're telling people where they can and can't build. And it's related to flood hazards or hazard lands. And then we have the other hat where we have ecologists and hydrogeologists who are studying the environment, who are collecting data. They're feeding into the state of biodiversity, species at risk, water quality, and then from there it passes on to teams that are looking at, well, where do we need to restore, right? And how do we come up with a restoration plan to fix something, to move the needle on one of the metrics that is being measured. And then it goes to the sort of operations heavy teams that actually go and do the restoration, or whether it's planting or creating wetlands or other types of habitats. And so we play both of these roles. And what's really clear is that it's not either or, it's and both. And it is absolutely possible. But to achieve that, you kind of have to counter some of the false narratives that are out there that push us towards either or. That somehow setting aside green space means you're losing economic opportunity, that somehow housing prices are high because we have too much environmental regulation in the province, or there isn't enough land. These are false narratives. And once they start to proliferate, then I think arguments on both sides start getting pushed to the extreme. That to me is one of the areas that I get quite passionate about, is actually talking to both sides to say it's not quite that extreme, as you're presenting it, but also not as extreme as you're presenting it, and you have to do that to find that collaborative middle, and I think if you can do that, then you can get to and both. Otherwise, it's always either or.
You're really speaking to our Narwhal hearts over here. We're big on this concept called complicating the narrative, which is all about that. So I'm really happy you brought that up. And yeah, you're right. It does get so interesting with the misinformation. Victor brought up that there's ample land in the Greater Golden Horseshoe for the development that we need, and I find that not a lot of people I talk to know about that. And speaking of land, I wanted to get into farmland, because our very own Fatima Syed just wrote a really, really good story about how York Region has voted to open up 1,400 acres of agricultural greenbelt land to recreational development. And if we're also talking about stuff that's affecting agricultural land, Highway 413 would certainly cut through some of that. And this is important because local food security is a big consideration when we're talking about climate change mitigation. And so let's talk about how we protect farmland in the Greenbelt. What policies do we need at any level of government, and how do we make farming in the Greenbelt a realistic career choice for current and future residents? Justina, do you want to get us going?
in agricultural, the farming communities are hugely important, as you've said, and in these areas, these are also really important for biodiversity, for climate capture, and so forth. The intensification of agriculture has been really difficult in terms of having led to a lot of land clearing and all of these, the forests and wetlands that I've been talking about previously. So there is a lot that we can do with respect to food security in terms of local food and really supporting the smaller farmers and landholders in this region. So I think it's really those trends that we have to be watching out for with respect to the question that you're asking.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Hassan, what do you think?
I don't have much to add, so I'm going to pass it on to Victor. I think Justina covered it really well, and I'll point out that, you know, around the Greenbelt, there's the Greenbelt Foundation, and they have done a lot of work in promoting agriculture and other financial, you know, opportunities that come out of the Greenbelt, such as tourism, such as recreation. But farming is a big one. The affordability of being able to farm is a huge piece, right? There are lots of people I know in our watershed. I always say watershed, so that's just how I look at things on a map. So, but Emma mentioned earlier where my watershed is. But a lot of people in our watershed actually talk to us and say they'd love to farm because even, you know, like lots of new immigrants that come to Canada come from farming backgrounds and they can farm, but they end up in the GTA where it's so expensive to acquire land to farm. So, you know, there's no shortage, I think, of people willing to farm. We have to secure the spaces for that to occur.
I think securing the spaces is really important. You have me thinking about the push and pull between development and agriculture. And you're right, someone who's looking to buy agricultural land in this region is probably going to be duking it out with someone who's buying it for development or for land speculation. And Victor, I'm hoping you can raise a little rabble about this. Do you want to jump in and tell us what you think needs to happen to preserve farming in the Greenbelt?
Sure, Emma. But I'll start by saying it's not just the Greenbelt, it's the broader region as well, because the Greenbelt only protects 20% of the land within the Greater Golden Horseshoe. And the rest of the 80% can still be converted to urban uses and other uses. But focusing on the Greenbelt, and let's look at York Region's little proposal, the minister, the first thing we should do is just say no. The proposal does not comply with the Greenbelt Plan, and the minister and the government need to stand up and protect the Greenbelt by insisting that the policies are adhered to. And this should have never happened. They could have told York Region Council this before they even moved forward to adopt it, because York Region staff even told them that it didn't comply. So stand up for the policies. The second thing we should do is don't promote highways like the 413 and Bradford bypass that cut through the heart of the Greenbelt when it comes to the bypass entirely within it and through major parts of it with respect to the 413. By doing these highway proposals or promoting them, they're actually invigorating and fanning the expectations of developers who've speculated on farmland within the Greenbelt in the case of the bypass. And with respect to the 413, they're bringing major urbanization closer and closer to the Greenbelt because that's what that highway will facilitate. And that's going to put even more pressure for speculation within it and political lobbying and pressure to shrink it or move it or allow urban uses in it like York has proposed. So stand up for the plan. Don't look at sprawl-inducing highways as our future. Look inwards. In terms of policies, I'll offer those some constructive examples. So optimizing the type of things that one can do on the farm in terms of what we call secondary or on-farm diversified uses. provide other streams of revenue to help support farmers who are still in the green belt. Allow agriculturally related uses, different types of farming, perhaps on smaller parcels like market gardening and roadside and markets and things like that. And we've even seen some interesting proposals for cooperative leasing arrangements on farm parcels, particularly for new Canadians who are used to farming smaller parcels, and this would give them a foothold within the region, given some of the land prices. But even out in the Rouge Park, the federal and provincial governments own lots of land. The feds control most of it in the park now, but there's other holdings, and those levels of government could offer up different arrangements to encourage new farmers at a more economic price to get engaged. So I think there's some real things we could do. And another example is the Rouge Park itself. If you go through there and there's lots of farmland in it and it's being farmed, there's lots of commuter traffic cutting through the park. Well, they could actually start to dedicate some of the roads in the park for agriculture by restricting rush hour traffic from cutting through. And they do this for residential neighborhoods all the time, right? No right turn from 7 to 9 or 4 to 6 or whatever. We could do that to help reduce the conflicts in terms of moving agricultural equipment in areas like the Rouge. So I think there's a lot of things we can do, but we need to stick up for the plan and our agricultural policies elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that leads us very well into our next question, so thank you. And this is our last one for the prepared questions, and then we'll get into all the juicy stuff that all of you want to know. But our last one is kind of a speed round, 5 minutes. We want to talk about the political and environmental future of the Greenbelt, which is the tagline tonight. So what are the challenges in maintaining and even growing what we have here? Politically, policy-wise, I want to hear it. I want to hear about how we can resolve all these tensions long-term. And what are the short and long-term climate challenges for the region? What steps should we be taking now? Victor's already gotten into some of it, but give me your stream of consciousness. Hassan, do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll try. It's not perfection that we need to be looking at. Are there always going to be questions asked about the boundaries of the belt, the jagged edges, how it was constructed? Yes, who cares? It's there, and you have to look at it at a macro level, and it's a fantastic thing that's been set aside. So how do we build from here, right? It's not in pristine condition. There are degraded areas, there are deforested areas, there are plantations that are not natural forests that need to be looked at. Then there are the boundary areas where urbanization is occurring. What are their impacts? What are the buffers that we need? What tree species will survive where? There are wetlands that are full of invasives. There's a tremendous opportunity to use science to just continue to enhance. So I think there needs to be political will, and there needs to be clarity from the province that says, look, we are going to get a cohesive picture of the ecological value of the Greenbelt. That's step one. And once we have that cohesive picture, you know where you are, you can then bring in strategies to try and improve it. So on the one hand, and this shouldn't be a highly political thing to do, because we're not talking about anything to do with growing it or not growing it, or adding fingers or chopping off fingers within the Greenbelt. This is purely, let's enhance what we've got. So we need, this shouldn't even require political will. This should be a no-brainer. Then on the other hand, you really do need to look at protecting it, and not protecting it in a way where you're fighting for minimums on development applications. You should be incentivizing, so you're partnering for maximums. You're designing communities that have true active transportation. So to get from your urbanized subdivision or a townhouse complex or a complex of high rises into the walks and the hikes within the Greenbelt, you're not having to walk across 6 or 8 lanes of not even highways, just roads, There's so much that can happen. And that's what I mean by partnering for maximums rather than fighting for minimums. And if all we do is look at this green shaded thing on a map and sit down and say, well, here's the line, so you can't cross it, you can do stuff over here. You know, that's the wrong level you know, it's not going to lead to enhancements. And so sometimes you have to pick a different lane, and you just have to change the narrative and say, enough about growing it or shrinking it. Let's really talk about how we work with it. And so, you know, that's my hope. And I don't think that that's a bridge too far to cross, you know, from where we already are. But that again goes back to my opening of, are we going to build on this truly visionary piece, or are we going to squander this advantage, like we've done in some cases with the Conservation Authority model, right? With the continuous shrinking of the funding. Victor mentioned this when we had our pre-call, you know, hosting delegations from all over the world would come to talk to him about, you know, the Greenbelt. And I've done the same for conservation authorities. And quite often the feedback that I get, the number one question I get from these delegations from all over the world, they're usually government delegations. They look at everything that a CA does and they say, oh, it's just too late for us. We've already piped all our creeks. We've already built in all the hazard lands. And we've paved over all the wetlands. You know, if only we had started when Ontario started in the 40s and 50s to take this approach, we could do so much with it, you know. And that frustrates me to say, but we did start in the 40s and 50s. And now we're finding ways to constrain it. And we should be doing is really running with this thing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I hope that we will run with it. I noticed that whenever someone talks about developing the Greenbelt, there's this huge outcry, right? And hopefully the public is engaged enough and cares. Victor, I think we want to go to you next. Where do you see this going?
I'll just offer two observations because I know we're touched for time. But firstly, one of the observations we've seen since the Greenbelt, and you mentioned Scugog, is both farmers and municipalities are feeling, those within inside the Greenbelt are feeling disadvantaged compared to those beyond. And we've set up this kind of divergence. And so my view is that firm urban boundaries would allow all farmers and all municipalities to be treated equally and would reduce some of this friction between the two. Another big challenge is the lack of understanding in the general public, but the politicians in particular. So I think more education and awareness raising about the benefits of compact urban form for nature, for the economy, for community, utilizing science from people like Justina and Hassaan and all their colleagues is really, really important to help position us over the long run.
Awesome. And Justina, finish us off. What do you think we need to do?
On Monday, the Auditor General of Ontario released a series of reports about the state of the environment, which were dramatic, showed some dramatic numbers in terms of both, and these are changes that have happened over a period of a number of years that have gone before this government and previously, which showed what are the consequences of a lack of investment in monitoring, in tracking, our nature and natural systems, our climate, our targets that we've set, how the oversight of permitting is almost absent and escalating. So this whole phenomenon of piecemeal decision-making has magnified in significant ways. We had what was called or thought of at the time as a world-class Endangered Species Act in 2009, and the number of species has increased by 22% since that time. And a lot of that is happening around Southern Ontario because that's where the hot spot of biodiversity is. That's where all of these enormous values are most concentrated and what the Greenbelt has been serving to really protect. So I'm worried about the lack of investment. I'm worried that ignorance is bliss in a sense, that if we don't know what's out there and what the trends are, and how well or poorly we're protecting them, then we don't fight for it as much. And biodiversity is very difficult to protect, and because it's often hidden and we don't see it and we don't understand the variety. But we also have to really track all of these trends much more carefully. And I do think the word is investment, and not think about it as a cost, because as somebody in the chat said at some point, these are tremendous assets and they're critical for our well-being. Ecological collapse is as important as the climate emergency, and they're both interwoven. And I think that's the last thing I'll say. I tried to be optimistic at the end, but
I feel optimistic. I think I do. Well, thank you. Thank you all for all of your time. I feel like I could keep going on this for literal days, which is why my friends and family know not to engage with me about the Greenbelt anymore. But now I want to move on to some of the questions from the audience, because you folks ask more interesting stuff than me anyway. So Fatima's gonna give us some questions.
Yeah, wow, we learned so much in that conversation.
The true power hour.
And I have like 150 questions, so I apologize in advance that I'm not going to be able to get to everyone's, but I will try and get to the ones that a lot of you asked. And if you do want deep dives on some of the things that you're asking about, whether it's soil, sprawl, highways, just general Greenbelt stuff, wildlife, all the questions you're asking about, please subscribe. There will be a link in the chat box. We'd love your support, and you can get a free toque if you do it before tomorrow. So first question, and we'll try and keep these responses brief so we can get to as many questions as possible. Leslie White-Eye and Ciara Rodsep, I hope I pronounced them right, are both curious about the role of First Nations in the work of protecting the Greenbelt. There's a woman named Bethany Kuntz Wakefield who in the chat mentioned that she is from the Six Nations of the Grand River, and that she is concerned that the government isn't really consulting with them and taking away their homes. So Victor, to what extent do Indigenous rights and responsibilities exist in the work of the Greenbelt?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm just going to share the experience. So when we were developing it, we went to some great lengths to reach out and engage with Indigenous communities. We were down in the Six Nations and the Mississaugas of the New Credit and out at Curve Lake, and sitting down face to face and sharing our vision for what we were trying to achieve with the Greenbelt, and listening to the feedback from the communities and how they saw management of the land. And I like to think there was a lot of alignment there, because the Greenbelt was really about protecting a lot of the values in terms of the environment and the land that were completely common with those of the Indigenous communities we met with. It's an ongoing challenge for sure, but I think there's lots of opportunities for coalescing communal values in terms of things like the Greenbelt and growing it. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Victor. Hassan, Justina, anything to add?
Well, if I could jump in, since no one else has anything to add, I think one thing that's really important is there's a broad recognition now that Indigenous-led conservation tends to be the most successful conservation. And the Greenbelt Foundation, which Hassan mentioned earlier, stewards a lot of the Greenbelt. They are recognizing that, and there are some really cool projects that they're working on that incorporate that. So Alderville First Nation has a really awesome native plant nursery. There's also a moccasin history project where there are like these beautiful moccasins placed at like historic sites for the First Nations whose home it is. So yeah, you should check those out.
Thanks, Emma. So our second question is about how will climate change impact the Greenbelt? And Hassan, maybe I'll start with you. What are you seeing in the conservation spaces? What are you concerned about when it comes to the impacts of the climate emergency on this land?
Thanks, Fatima. Maybe I'll give you an example that might put it in context. And it's actually quite a sad example. So my conservation authority over the last 3 years has cut down more trees than it's planted, right? And it spent more money cutting trees down than we have planting trees. Now, what are the trees we're cutting down? Ash trees, impacted by invasives, by emerald ash borer. They turn into hazard trees. They have to be removed. So there's a cost of neglect, and it actually, everybody loves tree planting. The journey starts when you put a tree in the ground. It doesn't end there. You have to maintain it, you have to nurture it, you have to look at forest health, you have to do surveys. There's so much that goes into the environment. Yes, it's resilient, but we have such an impact on it. And climate change has such an impact on it that it needs a helping hand. And you have to understand what that's going to be, whether that's restoration or invasives or building resilience, into the landscape somehow. So those are going to be the effects on the greenbelt of climate change, and we need to be studying it, and we need to set aside proper dollars to be able to do this. It does not happen for free. And the cost of inaction, the actual dollar monetary cost of inaction, will be much greater than an investment into progressively staying ahead of it. And that, I will go back to my example of hazard tree removal due to invasives, right? Because that's a jarring example of how things can be impacted by climate change.
Thanks, Hassan. Justina, someone in the chat said Justina for Prime Minister. I wanted you to know that before you answer the question. So how is climate change impacting the Greenbelt?
Well, I'd like to tackle that sort of similar to Hassan and sort of talk about one example. I mean, climate change really exacerbates the other problems, and particularly that related to forest fragmentation and so forth. And I've mentioned a few times the relationship between the condition of nature and our health. And you'll have something like Lyme disease, for example, where you've got the types of critters that that carry the bacterium and so forth that do much better both in fragmented lands, and then also have been able to extend their range further north. And this is along with other invasive species and so forth. And so that is like a particularly, something that's happening with great speed actually over the last decade or so, where, incidences of Lyme disease and so forth are becoming more and more common. And these types of changes are really facilitated by a warming climate, but also exacerbated by these land use changes that we've been talking about.
Thank you so much. And my last question before we wrap up, this is by far the second most popular question after those about sprawl. I'd love all of you to answer. Give us one thing local residents of Ontario can do to help protect the Greenbelt. I think one person asked it he wrote it as, how do we make the Greenbelt inviolable, which I enjoyed. Victor, do you want to go first?
Sure. My own view is that land use planning is an extension of our democracy. We have public participation mechanisms built into our planning laws, even though the current government is doing its best to undermine a lot of those. And so the best way to get involved is to vote municipally, provincially, and bring up the topics that we've been talking about with the councillors as they come to the door, or you go to meetings and talk about this stuff and see where they stand, and then vote accordingly.
Thank you. Justina, one thing Ontarians can do to protect the Greenbelt.
Just be really aware. I mean, awareness sparks action. So as soon as you become aware of all of the issues, or at least the most, at least a subset of them, you can become it really can motivate and propel you towards the action that's suitable for you. I think too many people are not so aware of the importance of the Greenbelt, the history of the conservation authorities, the way in which the conservation authorities, the investment has changed the practice and role of conservation authorities, how the dangers to the protections that Greenbelt had put in place in 2005 and now are very different shape. Read things like the Auditor General's report. It sounds ridiculous, but it's actually quite accessible and fascinating. Read the Narwhal, because that's going to be really in depth in terms of journalism and so forth, which we have not had about Ontario issues of this nature to date. And that will motivate you to know what to do. I promise.
Thank you for the plug, Justina. And last but not least, Hassan, one thing Ontarians can do to protect the Greenbelt.
I would say pay attention to your local community. We automatically go to the position of the federal government, the position of the provincial government. A lot of people applauding Hamilton for the approach they took, and I hope it's some sort of domino that falls. That was a local decision that was driven by your municipal politicians who do a tremendous amount of work, and they actually impact you and your house and your family more than federal policy or provincial policy can in many cases. And so I would say, and I don't mean to use this word in a condescending way, but really educate yourself on the issues. And don't just forward stuff, like click on it and read it, right? Because that's how false narratives start to proliferate on both sides. And I see this a lot at conservation authorities, where people will come to us and say, I want to help you because this is happening to you. And I'll say, actually, it's not happening to us. So, but you can still help us. And so, and that's important, right? Like really know the issues, what is happening, what is not, and then work within your community, work with your local politicians. There's a municipal election coming next year and a provincial election coming next year. And I would certainly hope that the environment is not number 7 or number 8 or number 9 on the list of issues. I hope it's number 1 when people knock at your doors, and that you ask for tangible plans, not rhetoric and sound bites. I think all those things are very important. And then lastly, just a plug for all the conservation areas and parks and green space. Doesn't matter who runs it, just get out there and enjoy it. I think, at the end of the day, that is probably as important as anything else. So we'd love for people to get out there and enjoy it in all 4 seasons.
Spoken like a true conservation authority head. Bonus question, Hassan. What is the poster behind you? There's a lot of speculation.
This one?
Yeah.
It's actually Formula One racetracks.
See, I thought it might be species, but thank you.
My theory was lakes. I don't know why I thought it would be lakes.
I thought it was a species, but okay.
I get that question.
This conversation could have gone on for another 2 hours because I have 136 more questions, so we'll have to do this again. But for now, because we're over time, and I'm so grateful for all the engagement and this crash course about the Greenbelt, I'm going to hand it over to Denise to say goodbye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Victor, Hassan, Justina. Thank you so much for being here and sharing all your knowledge with us. We are planning to do a lot more reporting on the Greenbelt, and so it's really great to have you here and help us set this foundation. And thank you for your belief in our reporting. So please let us know what you think of it, even if we do stuff wrong. And that's nice of you, Justina, to think that we all have the capacity to read that 489-page Auditor General report, but we are not all Emma McIntosh. So for anyone who doesn't feel they can do that, we've dropped the link to her story about it into the chat today. And for all of our audience members, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to those of you who are already Narwhal members. And if you're not, please consider becoming one. We really think that the Narwhal brings something new and important to the journalism scene here in Ontario, and we could use your help. All right, so thanks so much and good night, everyone.